Just let everyone leave first. It's disgusting. How do you follow such a great talk, hey? That was brilliant. I enjoyed that. Really interesting work, and shameless plugging for our group as well. So even better on my view. But joking aside, if you do want to join the ICES working group, we've got about I think about 150 members from 36 countries now. So if anyone wants to join, just drop me an email and we'll get you involved. Yeah, there you go. Open offer. There's a poster with what we do on it, so you can have a look there. But what I'm here to talk about is not that. But it does come up in here, is to talk about a roadmap for inclusion of marine recreational fisheries in advice. So recreational fisheries across Europe, that's the area I'm going to focus on. They're pretty important. There's a lot of people that go. There's about 9 million. They fish a lot with different gears. There's different species that are targeted, and they spend quite a lot of money as well, around 6 billion. And when you do total economic impact, it's about 10 billion. And there are lots of opportunities and so on and so forth. But there are impacts as well. So one of the big impacts is the impacts on stocks, on the fish that we're fishing for. Both in terms of how much is taken out, but in terms of the selective pressures as well. For those of you that don't know much about Europe, it's quite a complicated situation in Europe. We've got lots of countries, many of which are within our European Union, and some of which aren't anymore, and some of which have never been. And some of which have agreements with European Union as well. But what you can see here is that politically it's quite a complicated picture. And you've got tension in the legislation that we have. So not just in the legislation, but also about who's responsible for implementing it. So you've got the European Union, and their idea is if we want to rebuild stocks, we need to work with the Common Fisheries Policy, which has very, very little in it about recreational fishing. There's literally one sentence in it. But there's also the control and technical side of things, which have more information on marine recreational fisheries in there, including supposed mandatory reporting coming through. And there's also the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which talks about not just the stocks themselves, but also the characteristics, so the sets of the populations that you see, the size structure and things like that. But management of recreational fisheries in Europe is a national competency. So it's up to the individual nations to decide how they're going to implement what's going on. And they're also responsible for management and direct data collection. And then we've got people like the UK and Norway and others that are coastal states that don't necessarily have the same legislation, but we do have lots and lots of shared stocks. So where does our catch advice come from? So there's this thing called the International Council for Exploration of the Sea, called ICES, and there are a load of member countries of ICES, as Kirsten said, and the idea of ICES is to bring people together to talk about fish and other things that relate to the marine environment. It's a group of about 6,000 experts from 700 institutions and organisations, and they've got 150 working or expert groups, and one of which is the Working Group on Recreational Fisheries side of things. And one of the big things that they are responsible for is this kind of evidence-based scientific advice. So what does that mean for recreational fisheries? So this is the grant agreement between ICES and the European Union. And in the last couple of years, we've seen that this has come through, where they've said basically as part of this, where recreational fisheries take a significant part of the catch, we need to understand the sources of fisheries mortality, whether it's called by recreational fisheries alone or a combination of commercial and recreational fisheries or commercial fisheries alone. We need to understand both the magnitude and relatively proportion of their catches, and that ICES will review and incorporate where possible in its stock assessments recreational fisheries management measures, and ICES will comment on their contribution to reaching the objectives, which in the CFP are categorised as maximal sustainable yield. So that basically means we have to do something. But so far, the challenge is that there are very, very few species that are included in stock assessment. And I've talked about the data and the modelling approach earlier that we've gone through to try and get data into it. I've talked a little bit about the priorities and framework in one of Zach's presentations earlier. But what I'm going to talk about here is how do you actually get people to move in a direction? Because, as I've said many times, the stock assessment community are quite traditional in their approaches and the data that they're willing to use. And here comes the new kid on the block, the recreational thing. And it's quite a challenge because we don't have consistent time series that go back many, many years. So, but there's a tension against the ICES and the requests that the countries have around generating information. So how are we going to do that? We have to come up with some kind of roadmap to work forward. So what are we missing and what do we need to do in future? So this is where the ICES working group on recreational fisheries surveys came in. We've been working through the ICES process to generate our roadmap. So where do we sit? So we sit, that's us there. And basically, we contribute into the benchmarking process and the fisheries expert assessment groups that then generate the advice. But we need to make that link into there more rigorous and more successful in terms of getting our data into the assessments. And that's what this roadmap is all about. So what does it say? Well, I came up with this lovely visual model called Daisy, which is named after my daughter. It took me a while to work out what to call why. But basically, there's kind of 5 strands to this. So we need to make sure that we've got the right data. It needs to be robust and it needs to be accessible. We need to understand what's going to end up in advice. So we need to have an agreed approach. We need to have some degree of integration. How are we going to get these things into the assessment? We need to have the science in place to attack the issues that we have. And one that's the last one, and the why, is the yearly bit. These assessments are on an annual cycle. And if you can imagine that you're creating a diary-based approach, you have to have estimates ready by March or April to go into the next year. So if you've got a diary-based approach, you maybe finish that at the end of January. You maybe don't get your data till February or mid-March, and then you've got to process it quite quickly. So what are we going to do within each of those? Oops, sorry. Let's go back again. Come on. There we go. So what are we going to do within these things? So we kind of came up with 12 recommendations or 12 actions that we needed to do. So with the data, we really need to understand where we are. So where we are and what are we going to need in future. So we're in the process of doing a stock take. We've put out a call for all of the data across nations on all of the species, and we're looking into that at the moment to understand what's there. At the moment, that data is quite difficult to access. So, for example, when a data call comes out, there was a stock assessment for cod that was done a while back, and the data call went out and one country responded. And I sat there thinking that I know that there's at least 8 countries that have data on this. So that's one of the challenges that we have. If it's not available to the stock assessment people, then they won't actually do anything about it. They'll just go, it's an uncertainty, and they'll include it in that way. In terms of advice, we've now got a standard format for advice, which includes the recreational component and the commercial component separately. We also need to make sure that there's special requests that come in all the time. to ICES for advice on recreational fishing, but often they haven't talked to us. So there's need from that perspective to really get those special requests agreed with the working groups on recreational fisheries. And one example of that at the moment is that we're talking about producing there's an update to the sea bass management tool that's out there that's looking at the impact of changing management measures on the catch. And that's something, a special request that's come in. We've talked about that and we'll agree a way forwards with it. In terms of integration, well, we can't do everything at once. We need to prioritise what's there. So we've been doing productivity susceptibility analyses to try and work out how the best and where to focus our effort. We need to make sure that the data is provided, so people respond to data calls and those data calls go to the right place, because generally the people that hold the recreational data are very different to the people that hold the commercial data. And the stuff goes into the commercial, or the data calls go into the traditional routes and they just write back saying there are no data, but they don't know who to ask. And the last thing is really about inclusion in assessments, and I talked a little bit about this earlier where we had the working group or the workshop on recreational fishery surveys in stock assessment, where we produced flow diagrams for all of these processes to try and get recreational data into stock assessment. From a science perspective, there are some really important things that really need to start going on. And from a data generation point, we need to think a lot about non-probability approaches and this challenge that we have with declining response rates, our traditional approaches to surveys, and how we can think about integrating those probability and non-probability approaches. We need to think about the impact on fish stocks. We need to think about catch and release, particularly things like post-release mortality, and how we actually, the methods for understanding those things. Catch allocation. That's another big challenge for us. How do you make decisions about who should get what in the societal context? I'm not purporting to have any answers to any of these questions, but these are things that we really need to understand. And how do we actually, what does society want out of the fish that we have in the sea? Is it recreational fishing or is it commercial? Is it just to be able to have a nice environment? Who knows? But those are really important. And last but not least, is really the human dimensions. We need to think, there's that old adage from Ray Hilborn that managing fish is about managing people, or managing fisheries is about managing people. It's not about managing fish. And that, this behaviour and compliance side of things is really important, because in Europe we have very, very little in the way of enforcement. So understanding people's behaviour and how they might comply with regulations and what might engender compliance is really important. One of the things that strikes me is that I wonder in Europe whether voluntary guidance is going to be more effective than actually mandatory stuff. And I might be talking a bit as a heathen here, but the reason for saying that is that voluntary measures have legitimacy that mandatory ones don't. And unless we can really work on the legitimacy of the mandatory measures, then we're going to struggle with compliance. So that was all I was going to say. So I've highlighted the importance of marine recreational fisheries in Europe. I've outlined the role of ICES and issues with including marine recreational fisheries in stock assessment. I've introduced the ICES roadmap and discussed where we are with progress. So thank you very much.